Coming up on the program, Nigeria's President Muhammadu Buhari addresses UN General Assembly in New York, speaks on COVID-19 pandemic, climate change, war on terror and other issues. A Ban official says executions will return in Afghanistan. Plus, North Korea says it's open to talks with South Korea, but under conditions. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Teniola Shoboale. We begin with the United Nations General Assembly continuing for a fourth day in New York. President Muhammadu Buhari, in his address, spoke about global initiatives at containing the coronavirus pandemic, declaring Nigeria's support for the COVAX initiative. He also thanked the US, China and India for developing and distributing vaccines. He, however, decried the inequitable distribution which hinders global efforts at containing the pandemic.
Nigeria remains grateful for the assistance received from our partners and friends all over the world. Vaccination is the key to our safe emergence from the pandemic. We fully support the COVAX initiative, from which we have benefited. We also thank the United States of America, Turkey, India, China, European Union, and others for the vaccines provided. Despite the acknowledgement, however, I would like to reiterate my call for a fairer and more equitable distribution of vaccines in all countries so that together we can fight and contain the pandemic. The rising wave of newer and more contagious strains makes this even more urgent.
President Buhari also called leaders out on exceeding term limits, identifying it as one of the causes of conflicts on the continent, examples of which are the coups in Mali and in Guinea.
In West Africa especially, our democratic gains of the past decades are now being eroded. The recent trend of unconstitutional takeover of power, sometimes in reaction to unilateral changes of constitution by some leaders, must not be tolerated by the international community. Nigeria fully supports the efforts of ECOWAS to address this growing challenge and appreciates the support of both the African Union and the United Nations. In this regard, I would like to reiterate that as leaders of our individual member states, we need to adhere to constitutional provisions of our countries, particularly on term limits. This is one area that generates crisis and political tension in our sub-region.
Well, he condemned the proliferation of small arms and light weapons, which is having social and economic consequences around the world, and called for greater cooperation by the international community to find solutions. He also promised that Nigeria will not spare Boko Haram.
Terrorism continues to dominate security discourse worldwide. In Nigeria, Boko Haram, terrorist group, though fragmented by internal strife and weakened by our defense forces, is still active and preying on soft targets. Nigeria will continue to work closely with United Nations counter-terrorism bodies and entities with a view to bringing this scourge to an end. Nigeria has spared no effort in addressing the challenges of terrorism posed by the activities of Boko Haram in northeast Nigeria, the Lake Chad region, as well as banditry in the northwest and north central. Nigeria remains deeply concerned over the illicit trade, transfer, and circulation of small arms and light weapons. Their excessive accumulation and uncontrolled spread in many regions of the world are having devastating humanitarian and socio-economic consequences, especially on the continent of Africa. It is on this note that my delegation calls for the worldwide application of the Arms Trade Treaty to codify accountability in conventional arms trade, which is critical to the security of nations.
Nigeria's President Muhammadu Buhari speaking there. To other stories now, the Taliban's notorious former head of religious police has announced that extreme punishments such as executions and amputations will resume in Afghanistan. In an interview with AFP News, Mullah Turabi, now in charge of prisons, said amputations are necessary for security. He said these punishments may not be meted out in public as they were under previous Taliban rule in the 1990s, but he dismissed outrage over their past public executions, saying no one will tell us what our laws should be. Since taking power in Afghanistan on August the 15th, the Taliban have been promising a milder form of rule than in their previous tenure, but there's already been several reports of human rights abuses carried out across the country. Security analyst David Otto joins us now for more on this. Thank you so much for your time on the program. The Taliban leaders have promised to take a softer approach in the country, but they've just announced the return of executions. There are also reports of officials searching out high-profile women, denying women freedom of movement outside their homes, and also imposing compulsory dress codes. Are we slowly seeing a return of the Afghanistan of 10 years ago?
I think what we're slowly seeing a return of is, what the Taliban leadership has made very clear, that this is going to be a government of the Islamic Emirates of Afghanistan. It's going to be ruled under Sharia law. So, in terms of its methods, I think, this is in accordance with Sharia law. So they're talking about, things like capital punishment, as you mentioned, amputation of arms. I mean, all these things are, are various punishments which have been applied to states that, are under the Islamic Sharia law. I mean, again, capital punishment is something that does exist in more than 53 countries in the world. So the Taliban are doing just what they've prescribed in their terms of office, but also, I don't think they will change from 20 years back in terms of what they want to, how they want to govern their country.
It's interesting that earlier this week, the Taliban requested to speak at the UN General Assembly being held in New York. A big ask from the Taliban, right?
Of course. I mean, the UN is in trouble here, because, of course, the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, actually received communication on the 15th of September from the accredited Afghan ambassador, Gulan Izakzai, and, he presented a list of the delegates. But then 5 days afterwards, I think the UN again received another, communication from the Taliban Foreign Affairs Minister, Amikan Muttaqi, who then said, listen, we are sending a delegate, to speak at the UN General Assembly. He made it very clear that with the ousting and the abandonment of power by the former Afghanistan President Ashraf Ghani, the delegate that is meant to speak at the UN General Assembly is no longer able to do that. So I think what will be resolved is through what you call the UN 11-member credentials committee. I think 9 or 11. They will have to resolve this. But what I see at the end of this, there will be some kind of a delay, and maybe the Taliban might not be able to speak. Mind you, they are meant to speak on the 27th, which is on Monday. But if this committee doesn't hold, in the case of a dispute, then I don't see the Taliban having the opportunity to speak at the UN General Assembly.
Okay, Spot, moving forward, how exactly should world leaders interact with the Taliban, seeing as for now they are here to stay?
I think what a lot of world leaders have been saying is using diplomatic words. They're saying that they are engaging with the Taliban, but they don't recognize them. So I think, this is just something that they're trying to use at this point in time because, of course, each country wants to see who would recognize the Taliban first. But for global security and stability, especially in the region, the Taliban government, Afghanistan is situated in a very precarious and geopolitical strategic area, neighboring Iran, China, Pakistan, and all the tanks, around that region. So I think countries have to learn to understand that this is a government that existed 20 years ago, irrespective of all the levels that have been put against it. The Taliban are back, and they are playing a very strategic role, and that must be recognized.
But it does seem that the one main challenge to the Taliban rule could be the Islamic State. Just on Wednesday, an attack killed at least 5 people in Nangarhar province, and that followed deadly weekend strikes on Taliban patrols. Will the Taliban be able to keep ISIS at bay?
Yes, I think, what is going to happen now in terms of that. Yes, I mean, what I see here is the Taliban having trouble keeping the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant, especially the Islamic State in the Khorasan province, very quiet. But also how they manage to keep Al-Qaeda quiet in the region. But they have to do that, and they have to move away from being an insurgent, government, so to speak, to a legitimate state. How they're going to do that is one of the things which a lot of countries have talked about in terms of, making sure that Afghanistan is not used by terrorist organizations to prepare or to plan or to launch attacks out of or within that country. So it's a huge task, in the hands of the Taliban. But they must be helped, by other countries in terms of understanding that, they cannot treat the Taliban no more as a terrorist state. They have to treat them as a legitimate state in order to engage with them properly.
All right, then, security analyst David Otto, thank you so much for your time on the program.
Thank you.
Still on the situation in Afghanistan, Nobel Peace Prize winner Malala, who was shot by a Taliban gunman in Pakistan as she left school in 2012, says because she was targeted by the Taliban for speaking out on the importance of education for girls and women, it proves that the Taliban leaders are scared of the voice of women and girls. She made the comments during a panel discussion on girls' education in Afghanistan on the sidelines of the United Nations General Assembly.
I was targeted for speaking out for girls' education, and it proved to me that the Taliban were scared of the voice of women and girls. They did not want to hear women and girls speak out for equality, and they did not want to see women being educated. And I knew that my right to education was not only granted to me by the constitution of my country, by the human rights conventions and legislations out there, but also by Islam. And when women are educated and when they know that their rights are protected within their religion, within their community, within their country, they are empowered. They cannot be told to sit in the house and not go to school and not do a job. So the education of women and girls is a threat to the ideology of extremism that the Taliban spread. And so I think, I want to say to Afghanistan, women and girls, that they must stand up for their rights, and they are, because so many of them have been in jobs, so many of them have been educated, they know their rights, and they cannot imagine living in a world where they would not have access to those opportunities anymore.
The United Nations says at least 350,209 people have been killed in 10 years of war in Syria. It's the body's first official death toll since 2014. The UN rights chief cautions that the figure is an undercount of the actual number of killings. A leading but unofficial UK-based monitoring group recently put the death toll at 606,000. The war in Syria has largely wound down, with just a single province now controlled by jihadists and rebels. At its height in 2015, armed groups had taken over large parts of the country, but the intervention of Russia in an aerial campaign on the side of Syrian President Bashar al-Assad turned the tide in his favor. And over in North Korea, the influential sister of leader Kim Jong-un says they are willing to resume talks with South Korea if it ends what she called hostile policies. Kim Yo-jong was responding to a renewed call from the South to officially declare an end to the Korean War. The conflict, which split the peninsula into two, ended in 1953 without a peace treaty. The two countries have technically been at war ever since and locked in a sometimes tense relationship. A senior executive of Chinese technology giant Huawei is due to appear virtually in a U.S. court after a deal to resolve fraud charges. Meng Wanzhou was detained nearly 3 years ago in Canada at the request of U.S. authorities, sparking an international dispute. Ms. Wang says she's innocent and has been fighting extradition to the U.S. The incident has strained China's relations with the U.S. and Canada. Now, two men posing as lawyers have shot dead a notorious gangster inside a courtroom in India's capital, Delhi. They opened fire at Jitendra Mangogi inside the courtroom in Rohini, where a case was being heard against him. Officials say police returned fire, killing the two men. Police suspect a rival gang planned the attack. Gogi was on Delhi's police most wanted list, and he was also a suspect in dozens of cases, including murder, kidnapping and fraud in other states. Now, young people around the world have taken to the streets to demand urgent action to avert disastrous climate change in their largest protest since the start of the COVID-19 pandemic. The strike takes place 5 weeks before the UN COP26 summit, which aims to secure more ambitious climate action from world leaders to drastically cut the greenhouse gas emissions heating the planet. In Germany, several thousand climate activists, including Sweden's Greta Thunberg, demonstrated in Berlin to pressure candidates competing to succeed Chancellor Angela Merkel at this weekend's general election to do more on climate change.
And it's been a really turbulent last year and a half. This has been a time where we have been reminded of how vulnerable we are. But we have also been reminded of how fast things can change and be turned completely upside down. In some parts of the world, we have experienced what it is like to truly treat an emergency like an emergency and to change social norms. But while all this has happened, of course, the climate crisis hasn't disappeared. And we have not disappeared. The concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere hasn't been this high for at least 3 million years. And if there's one other thing that this pandemic has shown us, it is that the climate crisis has never once been treated like an emergency. It is clearer than ever that no political party is doing close to enough. But it's even worse than that. Not even their proposed commitments are close to being aligned with what will be needed to fulfill the Paris Agreement. If we want to ensure a safe present and future on planet Earth, we need to be active democratic citizens and go out on the streets like we are doing today.
The UK student protesters also marched through London as part of the Fridays for Future global movement. Demonstrations were planned in more than 1,500 locations, kicking off in Asia with small-scale demonstrations in the Philippines and Bangladesh, and spreading throughout the day to countries in Europe.
Politicians love to talk, right? They love to promise big things, but in the end it's very hollow. What we need to do right now is leave all fossil fuels in the ground and cancel all fossil fuel investments. So we don't want to see any more talking, we want to see action now, because the next 10 years will decide the trajectory of human civilization. So we need action, and strong action, right now.
So I want to see, well, first to stop new fossil fuel investments. Well, there's a lot of climate action that can be done that's quite easy. We can also cancel debts. We can, just end a lot of empty promises that the government make, and actually also just provide the money that they say they're going to provide when they at the Paris Agreement.
Well, let's first acknowledge that it is just talking. So there are not actions being taken place at COP26, but their talking and their promises aren't even enough. You look at the country's nationally determined contributions, what they'll pledge to do for climate, it doesn't meet their commitment to limit warming at 1.5 degrees Celsius, not even close. We're on track for 3 degrees. So the first step would just for governments to be able to make promises that they will take enough action, let alone do the action necessary to fulfill their promises. So their promises are falling short and their action is falling short. But first, they've got to make the promises that they will take immediate action.
And also taking a stand for climate action is the French Spiderman. He navigated through metal railings and glass windows on the facade of the Otto Tower near Paris to urge world governments to do more to combat climate change. Climber Elaine Roberts took 15 minutes to reach the top of the 160-meter skyscraper at the La Défense Business District. He says he would like for governments of the whole world to invest more effort to fight climate change.
Alors, un avion commandé, comme tu sais, les petits avions hélicoptères comme ça. Je sais pas. Non, ça là, c'est un jouet. Non, il est parti vers là.
I guess every little helps. And finally on the program, Spain's La Palma volcano remains active with more explosive phases, but with a slower lava flow on its 6th day of eruption. 2 lava flows remain active, according to Spain's Department of Homeland Security. The northern one is almost at a standstill and has a maximum height of 12 meters, while the southern one is advancing at 4 to 5 meters per hour. Walls of lava, which turn black when exposed to the air, have advanced slowly westwards since Sunday, engulfing everything in their path, including houses, schools, and some banana plantations. More than 200 houses have been destroyed, and thousands have had to flee their homes. Well, that's the program today. Thank you so much for watching. I'm Teniola Shaboale. Have a lovely weekend.